And so now we're going to talk about objectives and performance measures. When we talk about objectives, that is a different way of stating that you are setting the grant up to get to define that desired end state of the grant performance period. Again, how is your community or how will your school benefit from having had those grant dollars to expend for that purpose? Your performance measures, on the other hand, are the means of measuring the progress towards meeting those objectives. They work in concert to help you define that end state and help you determine if your grant implementation has been successful or if you've achieved the outcomes that you have set out. So your outcomes, the important thing about outcomes is to remember that they're not activities. They're why you perform the activities. And so sometimes with outcomes, it's a little bit hard because you get so focused on maybe one particular thing. For some of the foundation grants, they know from the get-go that what they're going to write the grant for is maybe some new turnout gear for a fire station. That's important, but having the turnout gear in and of itself isn't necessarily the outcome of the grant. I would argue that it's not the outcome of the grant. What an outcome might be would be having all of the members of a fire station in compliance with the NFPA standards. That's more of an outcome that you can point to and say, see, we achieved that goal. You can even take that a little bit farther and say that by being 100% compliant in the NFPA standards, then that you could potentially reduce the number of injuries on the job, you could reduce the number of job incidents that you might have, or that your response times could be faster, or that, well, maybe not response times, but your ability to respond to an incident could be increased because you would have people, everybody who was in compliance with those standards, they would all be able to respond to an incident. So again, you want to define those outcomes prior to beginning your activities. And you don't want to confuse your activities, such as hiring an SRO or buying cameras or even installing them, with your outcomes, which would be based on what you expect those cameras to be able to do to increase the security of your school, what that turnout gear is going to do for your fire department, or how the SRO is going to help create a more secure environment for your school. So again, the important thing about outcomes is not to confuse them with the activities, but keep them focused on the end result of having a grant to implement. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the grant objectives, this is going to be an opportunity for you, our participants, to offer some objectives that you might use to apply to a grant program. Doesn't matter which program it is, but we would like to see some examples from you. When we did this last week, we had some fantastic examples. So I'll tell you now not to be shy. Whether it is the Foundation grant or the Homeland Security Program grant or the Secured School Safety grant, please feel free to suggest an objective that you might use for your grant program. And I can't see anyone typing. I promise this is a painless exercise. We do it live as well. So Mr. Tharp is going to be my buddy. He's going to offer one. Thank you so much.
David Schaefer.
Oh, good. And David Schaefer is going to have one to offer us as well. Because a lot of times you really are very close to the target of where you want to be. Sometimes those objectives just need a little bit more refining in order to be a really good, strong objective for your grant program. By offering you the opportunity to tell us what you might be considering as an objective, will help us do a little work with you to see if you are exactly on target, which we find plenty of times, or if maybe we just need to do a little bit more refining on that process in order to help you have some really strong objectives. Keep in mind also that you can have multiple objectives for one grant. It might be that you just have one. Can I refine what I'm asking for? Sure. What we're looking for is an objective that you would use for any of the Department of Homeland Security grant programs. So if you are with the Secured School Safety Program, what we're looking for is an objective that you would write into the grant program that would demonstrate how your grant would help your school be more secure at the end of the performance period. Okay, and Kenneth Tharp says, our objective is to provide video evidence to the courts to assist in providing evidence to the prosecutor for stronger criminal convictions and less court time, relieving added expenses to the taxpayer. So you're asking for card video systems. Okay, and so what your end result is could be higher conviction rates. And so that is good. That's stronger criminal conviction. You can talk about your conviction rates that you probably have already in your county. So that could be very, very positive. If you can document the decreased court time, that would be fantastic as well. So you are definitely on the right track with the in-car video systems and where you are going to go and how that's going to benefit your community. So Andrew Deming, objectives: cameras for more supervision, whistles for all staff members for quickly implementing lockdown procedures, and GPS radios for buses. Okay, your cameras and your radios, those are things that you're going to buy. Those are a little bit more in the activities category, and they deal with your budget. The cameras for more supervision, remember that the purposes of this grant program revolve around restricting access to your school or expediting notification of first responders. So how are your cameras going to help you do those two things? Are your cameras going to help you restrict access to the building, in that you will have fewer people who are unaccompanied or unescorted in your building? And the GPS radios for buses, how are those going to help you either to restrict access to your school or to expedite notification of first responders? The GPS radios for buses and the GPS systems for buses were a very interesting purchase that we saw in our last grant program. We had several that were not funded, but we did have some that were, and they were based on some evidence and some incidents that were documented within the school corporation that said they have X number of students who at times leave the bus when they are not supposed to, and they have to call law enforcement for a response. And also based on incidents where they had a person on a bus who was a threat to either the driver or to the students. And so their argument was that having those GPS units on the buses would help expedite notification of first responders because they would know exactly where they were on their route when help needed to be called and they needed first responders on scene. So Andrew says, police department and EMA will have access to camera system from dispatch. Dispatch will respond directly to first responders on scene. And so Andrew, yes, I think you're getting closer to looking at that objective, which would be either a reduced response time. So if you know what your response times are now and how they can be improved by the grant, that would be very much on target. Also, restricting access to the school could be involved in the police department and EMA having access to that camera system from dispatch. You might want to clarify, though, if they're going to have access all the time or if that feed would have to be given to them by the local school corporation. But you are definitely on the right path. Again, looking at the end result of that grant, how are your students going to be more secure for having that program in place? Do you have any more questions about the grant objectives that we've discussed before we move on? Okay, if you do have further questions, please feel free to contact me or Beth Mahan or Dan Goris, and we'll get their contact information for you as well for the Secured School Safety Grant Program. For the other grant programs, feel free to contact either the program manager listed on the grant or someone from the Grants Management Office. They would be happy to help you if you are looking for assistance in refining your grant objectives prior to submitting a proposal. And I see David Schaefer is typing information for us now, so we'll pause just a moment before we move on. Police Department and EMA, oh, okay, David's still typing. I thought I saw it move. We'll get David's question or suggestion. Any thoughts on the the objective you submitted? And David, I'm going to have to go back and look at this real fast because I think I missed you. In order to enhance school security, communications throughout the school building needs to be upgraded. Oh, thank you, David, for calling my attention to that again. I did totally skip over it. Okay, communications, very good. Again, please keep in mind that you have to fit within the purposes of the grant. So how will that enable you to expedite notification of first responders or restrict access to the school building? And you really need to talk about how that communication is going to impact your school or community. So, actually your school in this case. What is going to be the benefit to your students and your staff by increasing those communications? Trying to think of an objective off the top of my head. It could be that when you're if you do drills for lockdowns, that you could have that lockdown occur faster, that you could have it occur across multiple school buildings if you have that improved communication. It could also, let me think a little bit more. You could have also, we did have one school who had a very well developed objective about keeping their students safe and reducing the number of people who were in their building unaccompanied. And they really looked at the whole picture of that grant program. The Secured School Safety Grant Program only bought a piece of their entire objective. But what they were going for was reducing the number of people who are unaccompanied in their school building. So what they purchased with grant funds was an alarm system for their school. They already had the electronic door locks that needed a key fob in order to enter the building. Of course, exit was never a problem. Those exit doors were always easily accessible. But the issue when they installed the electronic door locks was that then they had some people who were then able to defeat that whole system by wedging a rock or something in between the door and the lock. And the person who wrote the grant said, you know, I'm not going to lie, I'm a former coach, and I know that it's part of our athletic staff that's doing that. Your cafeterias are also areas where frequently people can get into buildings when they're not supervised. So what he did was he devised an entire program. The alarms for those buildings, if they were open more than 16 or 24 seconds, were what was purchased with the grant. But he went beyond that and said, okay, so we found out with our first purchase that was prior to the grant that just doing one thing isn't necessarily going to make our kids more secure. So what we really are aiming for is reducing the number of people who are in our building unaccompanied. As part of the grant program then, they not only purchased the alarms with the grant funds, but they revisited their policies and procedures for having people in the building who were unaccompanied or who did not sign in correctly. And then they had professional development for their staff and their teachers at school so that everybody was on the same page and they all understood what the policies and procedures were for having people who were unaccompanied in the building. He even took it a step farther and said that they were going to have a testing program for that. So they were going to have people come in the building. The principal of the building or the superintendent would know who the people were who were in the building and what time they entered. And then they were going to time then how long it took for those policies and procedures to be implemented. So he set himself up right away with two goals. Number one, he had a target for the number of people who were in the building unaccompanied. He didn't have precise numbers from before, but he knew it was an issue. He knew it occurred more than just once a semester. And so he set a target. 3 people per semester, I think, was his target. The next target was for reducing the response times for people who were in the building who were unaccompanied. And he did that by establishing the test where he would know when someone was in the building and then they would time how long it took for the procedures to be implemented. So those are the types of objectives that we are looking for. And so, Bill, you bring up a good point. SMART goals are very important. And when we're talking about the grant objectives, we are talking about establishing SMART goals for the school safety grant. It is part of our later presentation as well. But yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. For people who aren't with the schools, if you have taken the HSEEP class, the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, you are well versed in SMART goals as well. So this is exactly what we're talking about, having an end state for your goal that's clearly defined by an objective that meets those SMART components of being specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. We are going to talk about that as we go along. So excellent job. You know exactly what we're talking about, and you are, it appears we're all on the same page as far as looking at those objectives is concerned. Activities. Again, there are two reasons we look at activities. One is we don't want to confuse our activities with our objectives. The other thing is we want to make sure that all the activities that we're undertaking are relevant to the grant program. So after you've established your objective, you need to look at your activities and determine what you currently do that provides support for the desired outcome. Sometimes it's important to understand what you're doing so that you don't accidentally or inadvertently leave something off that is continuing to be an effective part of your program. Who participates in these activities? Sometimes with the school programs, it's easy to focus on making sure that teachers participate in professional development. But you also have other staff in your buildings, whether they are the people who are the maintenance staff or cafeteria staff. A lot of times your secretaries and other people who can be in the building, even your volunteers, that could be easily overlooked. So who participates in the activities related to the grant? How do you support the activities? Then you look at, are there other objectives or other activities that might help support the desired outcomes? Are there things that you aren't doing right now that you could do in order to support the outcome? In the case of the alarms on the doors, one of the activities that they were not doing on a regular basis was reviewing their policies and procedures for how people sign into the building and what happens if there is someone unaccompanied in their building. They added that to their program because it's not something that existed before. And again, should others participate in the activities? After you know who is participating, do you have people that need to participate as time goes on? By the same token, are there people who are participating that aren't necessarily important to that process, that their time is not best spent participating in this activity? So those two things about the activities. Make sure you don't confuse them with the outcomes, because this is kind of the fun stuff you get to do. It's buying the cameras, it's installing them, it's, you know, the first day when they're operational, watching, you know, the things that you can capture and looking at the angles that you have and making sure that all of your angles are captured. Those are the fun activities, but make sure you're doing all of the activities that will support your outcome and that you're not confusing your outcomes with your activities. Outputs are important because you don't want to confuse your outputs with outcomes. We don't have a lot to say about the outputs, but you know, the end result of going through an SRO hiring process is that you have an SRO, which is fantastic. But having the SRO is not an outcome. Just having that person, hired is not going to get you to the outcome, which should be related to keeping your students secure in school. And so if your outcome is to reduce the number of suspensions and expulsions, or if the outcome is to make sure that your fire department is fully in compliance with the NFPA standards, then just buying the turnout gear is not an outcome, and just hiring the SRO is not an outcome. Those are the outputs. Performance measures. And again, the measures are telling you how you're making progress at achieving your objectives. They can be both quantitative and qualitative, and those are the measures that tell you when, how, and depending on your outcome, by how much things have changed since the beginning of the grant period. If you have an assessment that's not well connected with an outcome, you should probably reassess it. We all know that in schools these days, it's really easy to want to tie everything to I-STEP scores. My goodness, you've got lots of data on them, and you can see all kinds of aggregated and disaggregated data. But is improving I-STEP scores really an outcome that you would have from having a more safe and secure school environment, or from hiring an SRO? Eventually it could be, if you had a few other things along the way. So if you wanted to say perhaps that by hiring an SRO, then initially you anticipate that your school climate surveys are going to show that students are feeling more safe and secure at school, and then your attendance rates might go up, and also by feeling more safe and secure, you have more students there and they're more engaged in the learning process perhaps. And as time goes by, as that continues to happen, then maybe your I-STEP scores are going to continue to increase. But that might not be the best objective that you would write down for a one-year implementation goal for a secured school safety grant. It's also important to continually look at those measures and outcomes to determine if they need to be adjusted. Sometimes it's very, very possible to say that by purchasing certain equipment or hiring an SRO or doing any of the things that are connected with Department of Homeland Security grants that you anticipate a certain outcome. And the reason that you set those outcomes is not for people here at the Department of Homeland Security to monitor whether or not you're achieving them and to give you a passing grade or not. The objective is there so that you can determine if the impact is what you thought it would be. If you hire an SRO, for example, and you think that it's going to impact your attendance rates or some other aspect of your school, and it turns out that it doesn't, that doesn't mean that you didn't need an SRO. It just might mean that there are other measures and other activities you need to look at that are connected with it in order to help you achieve that outcome. So keep in mind that the objectives aren't just as a checkup, but they're there to help you evaluate consistently if the grant is having the desired effect. So when we talk about measures, we also need to talk about data. There are lots of things that qualify as data, and then there are a few things that sometimes we use that aren't necessarily data that we want to get away from. If we're talking about qualitative data, we're talking about standardized observations, standardized interviews, standardized surveys, and the important part of that standardization is that you're looking at everything through the same lens. If you are part of an EMA or law enforcement or a fire department, you have some qualitative data from any time that you do an exercise. That's basically the data that your controllers and evaluators are collecting during the time of the exercise. And so what you're not doing is comparing one part of one agency to another, but what you're doing is you're evaluating them in a standardized way against a set of standards that have already been set out. And that can be very important. That's a lot more important than anecdotal evidence of, well, gosh, it seemed like they knew what they were doing. Having those standardized observations and interviews is data that is helpful and is very important that you could use for your measures. The same for document analysis. Quantitative data is a lot easier to grab. Sometimes it's a lot easier to understand because you can always use assessment results, evaluation results. If you're a school in particular, attendance. These are the easy types of data that we've been talking about pretty much all day. Your suspension and expulsion reports, your reports of bullying activity in schools. It can be any documented number of occurrences within a specific time frame that you are looking to change over time. So what is not data? Things that aren't data include those anecdotes that we were talking about earlier. Activities. Again, don't confuse your activities with outcomes, objectives, or data. Feelings. A quick word on feelings. If you have a feeling that you need something, and it's like Erica was talking about earlier when she was going through the gaps and hazard analysis. Some things are so intuitive to you, you might not initially think that there is data that is easily acceptable. But think about why you have a feeling that you need certain things, or that you might be susceptible to a certain type of incident in your community. There is probably data in back of that you can use to support your outcomes and your needs as well. Tradition, just because you've always done something a certain way does not necessarily mean that you need to continue using it, and you shouldn't use it as the basis either for an objective or a needs assessment. And just for Bill, he is a good prognosticator. Your grant measures. Remember to keep your objectives, your measures smart. And again, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. If you keep that in mind when you're talking about your objectives, you are going to have very, very strong objectives for whatever grant program you are applying for. Any questions about objectives and performance measures before we move on?
I'm sending the registration link now.
Okay, keep watching. Rachel Woodall just put up the registration link for the webinar, so if you are taking this for EMPG credit, that's the link you want to click on to make sure that we know that you are here. Now we're going to turn it back over to Erica McDaniel, who's going to talk about MATCH and the different grant programs.